Hello, everybody. Thought I'd do a podcast today um, on topics that have been a lot in the news recently. The immigration crackdown by the Trump administration, the recent Supreme Court ruling restricting the power of the lower federal courts, and then Trump's tax bill, which as we speak is being voted on by the Senate. Um, Now, the news has done a lot of reporting on these issues lately, but the reason I wanted to do a podcast is same reason I always want to do a podcast, which is that I think the news has been covering these things very superficially and in some cases inaccurately, using just talking points from either side without really going into details or fairly representing different sides of the issues. And so I wanted to sort of recover each of these things, but give you more background detail or historical detail, or in the case of the tax bill, a little more or the Supreme Court ruling, a little more balanced view than you typically get on a newscast. And of course, more detail and more in-depth analysis than you would get in a typical newscast. And again, I'm doing this just because I don't like the way these things have been reported on recently. I feel like they're leaving out important details and important bits of information that in the reporting that the average person just doesn't know, and that might help them make decisions about how they feel about these things. So let's start with the immigration crackdown. Now here I think the news has been pretty fairly reporting, so for this one I just sort of want to give a little more background detail. As the news has been reporting, Trump was unhappy with the pace of deportations, that it was too slow, that through the first few months of his term, not enough illegal immigrants or undocumented folks were being deported. And so he told the ICE folks to get their act together. That's the Immigration and Customs Enforcement group that does the arresting of undocumented folks. And he told them to get their act together and deport 3,000 people a day, which is hard to do, particularly if you restrict it to just folks who've committed significant crimes. As the FBI has reported numerous times, the percentage of undocumented immigrants who commit serious crimes is actually much lower than the percentage of native-born Americans who commit serious crimes. And that's mostly because undocumented immigrants they know that if they commit crimes, they can get deported once they're in the justice system, and so they kind of want to avoid that. So undocumented immigrants actually tend to be much more on the straight and narrow and up when they're here, just because they don't want to come to the attention of authorities. So when Trump said initially that he only wanted to deport undocumented immigrants who were criminals, the bottom line is he couldn't find enough of them to satisfy his lust to deport a lot of people, millions and millions of people. So he lately what he's done is he's changed his orders to the ICE group. So instead of actually having them try to find undocumented immigrants who've committed serious crimes and deport them, he's now basically said, well, just their being here is a crime because they came here illegally, and so just deport all the ones you can find. And he basically just told the ICE agents to go to where undocumented immigrants tend to congregate, like workplaces and Home Depots, and just round up as many as you can, deport them. So he's violated a sort of a promise that he made in the most recent campaign, just because he wasn't meeting his quotas. And the ICE agents that are now picking up undocumented immigrants have been doing it in a rather frightening and pernicious manner. They've been going out wearing masks without uniforms, so they're basically plain clothes, wearing masks, driving regular sedans, not police cars or enforcement agent cars, and they've been grabbing people up off of the streets basically and handcuffing them or zip tying them and tossing them into cars and taking them away. And they're not bothering when they arrest people to really check their immigration status at all. So some people who've been arrested this way are actually native born and legal residents. They just happen to look Hispanic or have Hispanic surnames. Some of the folks who've been arrested have certain what were considered protected statuses. And yet it hasn't really stopped the process. But it has created some, dangerous situations. First of all, it's engendered a sort of a pushback where people are now protesting rather vigorously against these just random street grabs by officers who aren't even identifying themselves or checking status or even looking like officers. That creates, by the way, a dangerous situation on its own. Because if somebody comes up and grabs you and doesn't really identify themselves and they don't look like officers and they don't show a badge, it wouldn't be surprising if some folks defended themselves from this, not knowing that this was an official arrest. And we could have a situation where either individuals who are being arrested or officers get hurt because the people who are being arrested don't really know what's going on. They just know somebody's trying to grab them off the street. It wouldn't surprise me if some people started to defend themselves, particularly because what's now starting to happen is people who are actual criminals are starting to just imitate ICE officers, wearing masks, going on the streets, grabbing people, telling them they're ICE officers when they're not, and then just robbing them or, beating them for fun. So, it's this lack of identification has really created a chaotic situation on the streets. But, just as onerous as the people they're picking up, a lot of them are either truly citizens, so they shouldn't be subject to this kind of arrest, or they are people who thought they had protected status. Now, let me tell you a little about the statuses of undocumented folks. So let's say you come in and you're undocumented, you sort of sneak into the U.S. and you're undocumented, or you come in legally on a visa, but you overstay your visa. So let's say you come in on a just a normal visitor's visa, but you just come in and you stay. You don't leave, because the visa is only supposed to last for 30 days or 90 days or whatever, and you just overstay and decide to stay and work. So, there's a lot of people among the undocumented who are in that situation. They either snuck over illegally or they actually came legally under a visa but just overstayed it. So among these various folks, there's different kinds of statuses they can attain while they're here. For example, some people who come over the border came over under what's called protected status, or they're asylum seekers, meaning that there's some situation in the country they came from which put their lives at risk. And so they wanted to, achieve a safer environment by coming to the U.S., where they wouldn't be threatened. For example, if, they're members of a group that's being persecuted in their home countries, and they decided to come to the U.S. because here, presumably, they're not going to be persecuted. They could apply for, when they came over, illegally, or on a visa, they could apply for asylum or protected status, based on that. But folks who are in that situation, even if they've been granted asylum or protected status, Trump basically has signed executive orders waiving those statuses away and allowing ICE to pick up and deport people even if they'd already attained asylum or protected status. So that no longer helps. Now, people who came over even legally and got a green card, which you can get, going through a legal process here in the U.S. For example, if you marry somebody, if somebody who's not a U.S. citizen marries somebody who is, they can apply for what's called a green card based on the fact that they're now married to a U.S. citizen, and so for that reason want to stay in the country. And the green card lets you legally stay and work in the U.S. it's what's called permanent residency. So as long as you stay married, you can stay here, you can work here legally, and with your green card. Now, your green card you have to apply for. You don't get it automatically just because you marry a U.S. citizen, but it's usually a pretty straightforward application and assessment process, which takes a few months. Historically, green card holders have been protected individuals. But under the Trump regime, the green card no longer protects you from deportation. So some of the people who've been deported recently are actually green card holders, which is weird because green card is supposed to give you a permanent residency status, but Trump has waived that off with executive order, and so it no longer does. Even if you have a green card, you can be deported if they feel that you're no longer you're from the wrong group, essentially, we're in the country of origin, or if you commit minor crimes while you're here, you get a traffic ticket, whatever. And then there's people who have the highest level of, citizenry for non-citizens, for people who are from other countries, is you get what's called naturalization. Now, naturalization is a long process. Usually takes a year or 2 years, and it's a court proceeding, but it's one where you have to take the classes, and eventually, you take a test on citizenship, and you take an oath of allegiance to the United States, and after all that process, if you're approved at every step, you become what's called a naturalized citizen, which means you have the right to vote. It's not just the right to work like with a green card. You actually have a right to vote. And you essentially have the protections of a U.S. citizen. But even naturalized citizens under the Trump regime can be targets of deportation, but they have to be denaturalized first. So, for example, if a naturalized citizen, somebody who's essentially got full protected status here and even the right to vote, if they commit, let's say, a felony while they're here, they can be denaturalized through a court proceeding. This is an actual court proceeding. And if the court finds them a danger to the U.S. or a threat to the U.S., then they become denaturalized, they lose their naturalization, and as soon as that happens, then they can be deported. So there's basically no safe status, no completely safe status for anyone who's undocumented now. Even those who've been granted asylum, they're not safe. Folks who have green cards, they're not completely safe. Folks who've been naturalized, they have to be denaturalized by a court first, but then they're not safe. So Trump is going after them all, basically. We've got members of all of these groups who've been rounded up by ICE and are going through various stages of deportation. And so it's sad because a lot of these folks thought they were protected by the law. The people who were granted asylum, people who were granted protected status, people who had green cards, people who were naturalized, they thought they were very protected by the law. But the truth is, not so much under the Trump regime. ICE has been the ICE agents have been particularly nasty about this. They've actually been a lot of people they picked up at the courthouse. So people who were going in for court hearings on their immigration status, on their way in or on their way out of the court hearing, ICE was grabbing them. So these are people who are really trying to do the right thing. They're trying to go through the U.S. courts to get their statuses approved, and they're just getting picked up and tossed out. And particularly cruelly, after these folks are picked up, they're often moved a long way away because we don't have that many detention centers in the United States. And so folks who've been picked up by ICE are often taken hundreds of miles away, often to different states from where they were picked up and held. And they're often not allowed contact with the outside world for an extended period of time. So their loved ones, their friends, their relatives, often don't know where they are, don't even know that they've been arrested. It's just they don't come home one day. And this has been terrifying people in the immigrant community, people who don't have legal status and people who do, because they're being deported as well. So it's been really terrifying for these folks. And so what they're doing in response is they're spending as little time out as they can. They're trying to hunker down and stay hidden. But that's impacting their ability to work, their ability to go to school, which means to do what they came here to do, which was to better themselves, to better their families. So it's particularly nasty and cruel. And the fact that the ICE agents are hiding themselves, their identities when they make these arrests, also dramatically increases the chance of ugly and violent confrontations, and dangerous ones too. And the fact that people are imitating ICE agents to abuse immigrants is also, and other folks, is also, very alarming. So, this whole thing is ugly. It reeks of brown shirts and Gestapo from Nazi Germany, tactics and just the random street grabs and stuff like that. So this has engendered a backlash, protests, in some cases, like in LA, very large protests against these kinds of practices. A lot of people, even people who voted for Trump, are like, wait a minute, I didn't really vote for this, for us to have our gardener picked up, we don't have a gardener anymore because he was picked up in some random ICE raid, and, he's a good guy and he hasn't committed any crimes and he does a nice job for us, and now it's hard to find other folks to replace him because they don't want to go out. So there have been, there's an effect on working, on jobs and on, work getting done, which is often work that's often done by undocumented folks. And then, there's the just the cruelty of it, and the fact that Trump had really sort of promised, though not really, that he was going to limit his crackdown to criminals, but he's definitely not doing that anymore. He's basically seeing all undocumented folks as criminals, regardless of status, and just ordering ICE to go after them, to make his 3,000 a day quota so he can, because if he can get rid of 3,000 people a day, he can get rid of 1 million a year. And he's shooting for several million ultimately deported under his regime. So that's sort of a fuller description of the immigration crackdown. And, I'm going to spend one video, I think, on each of these things. So our next video will be on the Supreme Court ruling and then on the tax bill. I may be able to do those two in one video, but I think I'll probably need two for those two. And then when these are done, I want to do a video on reorganizing the Democratic Party and the resistance to this so that it's more focused and effective. Okay, so that's it for the first video, and we'll do the second and third ones in short order. Take care.